in the gilded halls of Raven's Hollow Palace, where every whisper carries the weight of a kingdom's future, Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Isabella face a choice that could either save their realm or tear their family apart forever. What they discovered in the ancient royal archives wasn't just a family secret. It was a revelation that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy itself. The morning mist clung to the towering spires of Raven's Hollow Palace like a shroud of secrets waiting to be unveiled. Crown Prince Alexander stood at the grand window of his private study, watching the sun struggle to pierce through the gray veil that had settled over the kingdom of Eldoria. His reflection in the ancient glass showed a man burdened beyond his 32 years, dark circles beneath eyes that once sparkled with the carefree joy of youth. "Your Highness," came a gentle voice from behind him. Princess Isabella, his beloved wife of 7 years, approached with the grace that had first captured his heart at a diplomatic gathering in neighboring Astoria. Her auburn hair caught what little light filtered through the window, creating a halo effect that made her appear almost ethereal. Yet Alexander could see the worry lines that had begun to etch themselves around her emerald eyes, evidence of the weight they both carried. "The council meeting begins in an hour," Isabella reminded him, her voice barely above a whisper. The walls of Raven's Hollow had ears, and they had learned long ago that even their most private conversations could become fodder for the court's relentless gossip mill. Alexander turned to face his wife, seeing his own fears reflected in her expression. For months now, they had been living with a truth so devastating that it threatened to unravel everything they had ever believed about their family, their legacy, and their right to rule. The discovery had come quite by accident during a routine renovation of the palace's east wing, when workers had uncovered a hidden chamber behind what they thought was merely decorative stonework. Inside that chamber, preserved by centuries of careful concealment, they had found documents that challenged the very legitimacy of the Raven's Hollow dynasty. Letters, signed confessions, and official records that painted a picture so different from the history taught in schools and celebrated in national holidays that Alexander sometimes wondered if he was living in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. "Do you think they suspect anything?" Isabella asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become both comfort and necessity over the past few tumultuous months. "Lord Blackwood has been asking pointed questions about the genealogical records," Alexander admitted, his jaw tightening at the thought of the ambitious nobleman who served as the kingdom's chancellor. "And Lady Margaret mentioned yesterday that several historians have been requesting access to the restricted archives." The restricted archives, a collection of documents so sensitive that only the monarch and their immediate heir were permitted to view them. Until recently, Alexander had assumed they contained nothing more than diplomatic correspondences and military strategies from bygone eras. He never imagined they might hold the key to understanding why his own bloodline's claim to the throne was built on a foundation of lies. Isabella squeezed his hand tighter. "We can't keep this secret forever, Alexander. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially in a place like this where information is currency and knowledge is power." She was right, of course. Raven's Hollow Palace was a microcosm of political intrigue, where servants whispered in corners, nobles plotted advancement, and every smile masked a calculation. The court had been Alexander's world since birth, but only now did he truly understand how precarious his position was, not just as crown prince, but as a man trying to navigate impossible choices. The couple had met during one of the most challenging periods in Eldoria's recent history. A trade dispute with the neighboring kingdom of Valeria had threatened to escalate into something far more serious, and diplomatic marriages were still considered an effective tool for maintaining peace. What had begun as political necessity, however, had blossomed into genuine love. Isabella brought not just her kingdom's alliance, but also a perspective that helped Alexander see beyond the constraints of royal protocol. Their wedding 7 years ago had been celebrated as a triumph of both diplomacy and romance. The entire kingdom had rejoiced as they watched their future king marry a princess who seemed to embody everything their people hoped for in a queen: intelligent, compassionate, and committed to the welfare of both their kingdoms. The early years of their marriage had been marked by successful policy initiatives, charitable endeavors, and what appeared to be a genuine partnership in both love and leadership. But now, Everything they had built together was threatened by revelations that called into question not just Alexander's right to rule, but the entire structure of the society they were meant to lead. The documents they had discovered suggested that the first king of Eldoria, Alexander's ancestor and namesake, had not been the legitimate heir as recorded in official histories. Instead, he appeared to have usurped the throne through a carefully orchestrated deception that involved forged documents, eliminated witnesses, and a cover-up so comprehensive that it had remained hidden for over 2 centuries. "There's something else," Isabella said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made Alexander's stomach clench with dread. "I received a letter this morning. Anonymous, but clearly from someone with access to palace correspondence." She reached into the folds of her morning dress and withdrew a piece of parchment, cream-colored and bearing the faint scent of lavender, the calling card of someone with refined tastes and significant resources. Alexander took the letter with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from anger or fear he couldn't be sure. The message was brief but chilling. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. Others are too dangerous to reveal. Choose wisely, Your Highness, for the eyes of history are watching, and the future of Eldoria hangs in the balance. Alexander read the words twice before looking up at Isabella, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her troubled expression. Someone else knew their secret. The question was whether this anonymous correspondent was an ally offering warning or an enemy issuing a threat. Who could have access to this information? Alexander wondered aloud, though he suspected the answer was more complex than either of them wanted to acknowledge. The palace employed hundreds of people, from high-ranking nobles to kitchen servants, and any one of them might have stumbled across something that led them to the same devastating truth. Isabella moved to her writing desk, a beautiful piece of furniture that had been a wedding gift from her parents. She pulled open one of the drawers and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. "I've been documenting everything since we made the discovery," she explained. "Every conversation that might be related, every person who has shown unusual interest in the archives, every detail that might help us understand how far this knowledge has spread." Alexander watched as she flipped through pages of meticulous notes, admiring once again the analytical mind that had made her such an effective partner in both personal and political matters. Isabella had a gift for seeing patterns and connections that others missed, a skill that had proven invaluable in court politics and would be essential as they navigated this crisis. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of entries from the past month. "Lord Blackwood has requested private meetings with 3 different archivists, all of whom have access to historical records. Lady Margaret has been asking questions about succession laws, particularly regarding challenges to hereditary claims. And yesterday, I overheard 2 of the senior courtiers discussing rumors about irregularities in the royal lineage." The evidence was mounting that their secret was no longer truly secret. The question now was how to respond to this growing awareness without either confirming suspicions or appearing defensive in a way that might trigger deeper investigations. The books of the evidence was dewed in the tables. 1. Alexander sank into one of the leather chairs that flanked the fireplace, feeling the weight of his crown, both literal and metaphorical, pressing down on him with unprecedented force. He had been raised from birth to assume the responsibilities of leadership, educated in statecraft and diplomacy, trained to make decisions that would affect thousands of people, but nothing in his preparation had equipped him to deal with the possibility that his entire claim to authority was based on a historical fraud. "What do you think our options are?" he asked Isabella, grateful as always for her counsel and perspective. Isabella closed her journal and moved to sit in the chair opposite him, her expression serious but determined. "As I see it, we have 3 possible courses of action," she said, her voice taking on the measured tone she used when analyzing complex political situations. "We can attempt to suppress the information completely, hoping that we can silence anyone who might expose the truth. We can try to control the narrative by revealing selected portions of what we've learned while maintaining that it doesn't affect the legitimacy of your rule. Or we can choose complete transparency and deal with whatever consequences emerge from that honesty." Each option carried enormous risks. Suppression might work in the short term, but it would require actions that went against both their moral principles and their vision of what kind of rulers they wanted to be. Partial revelation was a dangerous game that could backfire if additional information emerged that contradicted their chosen narrative. Complete transparency might preserve their integrity but could also destabilize the kingdom and potentially end the monarchy altogether. There's a fourth option, Alexander said quietly, the words feeling like ash in his mouth even as he spoke them. We could abdicate, step away from the throne before the truth comes out, and let the succession pass to my brother Marcus. Isabella was silent for a long moment, considering this possibility. Prince Marcus was well regarded by the court and the people, though he had always been more interested in military affairs than the intricacies of governance. If the truth about Alexander's lineage called his claim into question, Marcus's position might be equally compromised, depending on how the revelations were interpreted. Would that truly solve the problem? Isabella asked. Or would it simply transfer the burden to Marcus while still leaving the fundamental questions unanswered? Before Alexander could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. "Your Highness," came the voice of Thomas, Alexander's personal secretary and one of the few people in the palace they trusted completely. "Lord Blackwood requests an immediate audience. He says it's a matter of urgent importance to the crown." Alexander and Isabella exchanged a look that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Their anonymous correspondent had warned them that some secrets were too dangerous to keep buried, and now the kingdom's chancellor was demanding an unscheduled meeting on a matter of urgent importance. "Tell Lord Blackwood that I'll see him in the formal receiving room in 10 minutes, Alexander instructed, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. As Thomas's footsteps retreated down the corridor, Alexander stood and straightened his jacket, preparing to face whatever challenge Lord Blackwood was about to present. Isabella rose as well, moving to stand beside her husband in a gesture of solidarity that had become second nature over their years together. "Whatever he knows or suspects," she said quietly, "we face it together." Alexander nodded, drawing strength from her presence and her unwavering support. The next few hours would likely determine not just their personal future, but the fate of the kingdom they had sworn to serve and protect. The secret they had guarded so carefully was about to collide with the realities of palace politics, and the outcome would reshape everything they thought they knew about power, legitimacy, and the price of truth. As they prepared to leave the sanctuary of their private chambers and enter the public arena where their every word and gesture would be scrutinized for meaning, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping across a threshold from which there would be no return. The crown's secret was about to become the kingdom's crisis, and they would need every ounce of wisdom, courage, and unity they possessed to navigate the storm that was surely coming. The formal receiving room of Raven's Hollow Palace had witnessed countless moments of political significance throughout its 300-year history, but as Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Isabella entered its opulent confines, the air seemed charged with an intensity that made even the familiar surroundings feel foreign and threatening. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian carpets, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere that seemed fitting for the drama about to unfold. Lord Blackwood stood near the massive fireplace, his imposing figure silhouetted against the carved marble mantelpiece that depicted scenes from Eldoria's supposedly glorious past. At 58, the Chancellor commanded respect through a combination of intelligence, political acumen, and a carefully cultivated air of authority that made him formidable in any negotiation. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his dark suit impeccably tailored, and his expression revealed nothing of his intentions. "Your Highness, your Royal Highness," Lord Blackwood said, executing a precise bow that managed to convey respect while somehow maintaining an undertone of challenge. "Thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice." Alexander gestured toward the arrangement of chairs near the center of the room, a subtle assertion of control over the meeting's dynamics. "Please, Chancellor, take a seat. I understand you have a matter of urgent importance to discuss." As they settled into their respective chairs, Isabella positioning herself slightly to Alexander's right in a show of unified front, Lord Blackwood opened the leather portfolio he had been carrying. The sound of papers rustling seemed unnaturally loud in the vast room, each small noise amplified by the tension that none of them were willing to acknowledge directly. "Your Highness," Lord Blackwood began, his tone carefully neutral, "I have become aware of certain irregularities in the historical records that may require our immediate attention. Specifically, questions have been raised regarding some documentation in the restricted archives." The words hung in the air like an accusation waiting to be fully formed. Alexander felt Isabella's slight movement beside him, not visible to an outside observer, but a communication of alertness and support that only years of marriage could create. "What sort of irregularities?" Alexander asked, proud that his voice remained steady despite the hammering of his heart. Lord Blackwood withdrew a folder from his portfolio, placing it carefully on the small table that separated them. 3 days ago, I received a visit from Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, the kingdom's chief archivist. She brought to my attention some concerns about documentation she had been reviewing as part of the ongoing palace renovation project. Alexander's mind raced. Dr. Crawford had been present when the hidden chamber was discovered, though she had not been permitted to examine its contents directly. She was a woman of impeccable scholarly credentials and unquestioned integrity, precisely the sort of person whose concerns would be taken seriously by someone like Lord Blackwood. Dr. Crawford has spent considerable time reviewing genealogical records, the Chancellor continued, and she has identified what appear to be significant discrepancies between various historical accounts of the succession that brought the first King Alexander to the throne. These discrepancies suggest that the commonly accepted version of events may not be entirely accurate. Isabella leaned forward slightly. Chancellor, surely you understand that historical records from over 2 centuries ago often contain inconsistencies. The passage of time, different perspectives on events, and the limitations of record-keeping methods of that era would naturally create some variations in how events are documented. It was a skillful response that acknowledged the concern while suggesting rational explanations that didn't imply deliberate deception. Lord Blackwood nodded appreciatively, recognizing the diplomatic expertise behind her words. Indeed, Your Royal Highness. Under normal circumstances, such discrepancies would be of interest primarily to scholars and historians. However, Dr. Crawford's findings suggest something more troubling than mere inconsistencies of perspective or record-keeping. Lord Blackwood opened the folder and withdrew several photographs of documents, placing them on the table where Alexander and Isabella could see them. Even from a distance, Alexander recognized them as copies of some of the materials they had discovered in the hidden chamber. These documents, Lord Blackwood said, pointing to the photographs, appear to indicate that the first King Alexander may not have been the legitimate heir as recorded in official histories. If these documents are authentic, they suggest that he usurped the throne through deception and eliminated the true heir to establish his claim. The room fell silent except for the steady tick of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner. Alexander found himself staring at the photographs, seeing familiar handwriting and official seals that he and Isabella had spent countless hours analyzing over the past few months. The evidence of their family's original sin was now spread across the table between them and the one person who had the power and position to destroy everything they held dear. Chancellor, Alexander said carefully, you mentioned that Dr. Crawford has concerns about these documents. What exactly is she proposing to do with this information? Lord Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but Alexander caught a flicker of something, calculation perhaps, or satisfaction at having successfully maneuvered them into this conversation. Dr. Kassav, Crawford believes that the historical record should reflect accurate information, regardless of its political implications. She has requested permission to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the authenticity of these documents and to publish her findings in the Royal Historical Journal. The implications were staggering. The Royal Historical Journal was read not just by scholars, but by educated members of the nobility and foreign diplomats. An article questioning the legitimacy of the royal lineage would create a scandal that could reverberate far beyond Eldoria's borders, potentially destabilizing allied relationships and emboldening political opponents both domestically and internationally. Isabella spoke into the silence. And what is your position on Dr. Crawford's request, Chancellor? Lord Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in a gesture that Alexander had learned to recognize as a prelude to a carefully prepared statement. As Chancellor, my primary responsibility is to the stability and security of the kingdom. The question before us is whether revealing potentially damaging historical information serves the greater good or merely satisfies academic curiosity at the expense of political stability. It was a diplomatic way of saying that Lord Blackwood understood the explosive nature of the documents, but was willing to consider options other than immediate public disclosure. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and wariness. Relief that the Chancellor wasn't immediately demanding transparency, but wariness about what price might be attached to his discretion. However, Lord Blackwood continued, There are other considerations that complicate this situation. Dr. Crawford is not the only person who has become aware of these documents. The workers who discovered the hidden chamber have been talking, and several members of the court have begun asking questions about why certain areas of the archives have suddenly become restricted. Alexander's heart sank as he realized that their secret was already far more exposed than they had hoped. The palace's gossip network was legendary in its efficiency, and if rumors were already circulating, it might be impossible to contain the information much longer. Furthermore, the Chancellor added, I have reason to believe that foreign intelligence services may have become interested in this matter. There are indications that agents from Astoria and Valeria have been making discreet inquiries about Eldoria's succession laws and historical precedents. This was worse than Alexander had imagined. Foreign involvement transformed what might have been a domestic political crisis into a potential international incident. Both Astoria and Valeria had complex relationships with Eldoria, and either kingdom might see political advantage in destabilizing their neighbor through revelations about the monarchy's legitimacy. Isabella's voice was steady as she asked, What would you recommend as the appropriate course of action, Chancellor? Lord Blackwood was silent for several long moments, his gaze moving between the royal couple as if assessing their character and resolve. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of carefully considered strategy. I believe we have a narrow window of opportunity to control this situation before it spirals beyond our ability to manage it. My recommendation would be to convene a small, trusted group of advisors to develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing these revelations while minimizing their potential to destabilize the kingdom. Alexander found himself grateful for Lord Blackwood's measured approach, even as he wondered what the Chancellor's true motivations might be. In the complex world of palace politics, even apparent allies often had hidden agendas, and Lord Blackwood was far too experienced and ambitious to be acting purely from altruistic concern for the kingdom's welfare. Who would you propose to include in such a group? Alexander asked. In addition to ourselves, I would suggest Sir Marcus Whitfield, the kingdom's legal counsel, to advise us on the constitutional implications. Dame Catherine Morrison, our foreign affairs advisor, to help us understand the international ramifications, and perhaps Father Benedict from the Palace Chapel to provide guidance on the moral and ethical dimensions of our choices. It was a carefully selected group that represented key areas of expertise while including individuals known for their discretion and loyalty to the crown. Alexander appreciated the thoughtful composition, though he remained wary of expanding the circle of people who knew about the documents. And Dr. Crawford? Isabella asked. What would you propose regarding her request for permission to investigate and publish? Lord Blackwood's expression became more serious. I would recommend that we grant her request, but under carefully controlled conditions. We assign her a research partner who can monitor her work and ensure that any findings are reviewed by our advisory group before publication. This approach allows us to maintain the appearance of transparency while retaining control over how the information is presented. Alexander found himself impressed by the Chancellor's strategic thinking, even as he felt the weight of the impossible choices they faced. Every option seemed to involve some form of deception or manipulation, forcing them to choose between different forms of moral compromise. There's another consideration, Lord Blackwood added, his voice dropping slightly as if he were sharing information of particular sensitivity. I have been approached by representatives of Prince Marcus, who have expressed concerns about the stability of the succession in light of recent rumors. The mention of his brother sent a chill through Alexander's chest. Prince Marcus had always been loyal to the family and supportive of Alexander's position as heir, but the pressures of court politics had a way of testing even the strongest family bonds. If Marcus was beginning to position himself as an alternative to Alexander's rule, it could indicate that the political situation was deteriorating more rapidly than they had realized. What sort of concerns? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nothing overtly treasonous, Your Highness, but questions about whether recent developments might require a re-evaluation of succession plans. Prince Marcus has always been well regarded by the military, and there are those who believe his leadership might provide the stability the kingdom needs during uncertain times. Isabella leaned forward, her voice carrying a note of steel that Alexander recognized as her most formidable diplomatic tone. Chancellor, I hope you understand that any discussion of changing the succession would be premature without a thorough investigation of the facts, Rumors and speculation should not drive constitutional decisions. Lord Blackwood inclined his head respectfully. Of course, Your Royal Highness. I mentioned Prince Marcus's concerns only to illustrate the complexity of the political situation we face. The longer uncertainty persists, the more opportunity there is for various factions to advance their own agendas. Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where courtiers and visitors moved along carefully maintained paths. Each person in his view represented a potential ally or enemy, a source of support or a threat to be managed. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did at this moment, when every decision carried the potential to either save or destroy everything his family had built over generations. Chancellor, Alexander said without turning from the window, I appreciate your discretion in bringing this matter to our attention privately. Princess Isabella and I will need time to consider your recommendations before making any decisions about how to proceed. Of course, Your Highness. However, I should mention that Dr. Crawford is expecting a response to her request within the week. Additionally, the foreign inquiries I mentioned suggest that time may not be on our side in terms of maintaining control over this situation. Alexander turned back to face Lord Blackwood, seeing in the older man's expression a mixture of respect, concern, and what might have been sympathy. Despite his political sophistication and personal ambition, the Chancellor seemed genuinely concerned about finding a solution that would serve the kingdom's best interests. We understand the urgency, Isabella said, rising to signal that the meeting was concluding. We will convene with our most trusted advisors and provide you with our decision within 3 days. Lord Blackwood gathered his papers and stood as well, executing another precise bow. Very good, Your Royal Highness. I remain at your service in whatever capacity you deem appropriate. As the Chancellor left the room, Alexander and Isabella stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what they had just learned. The situation was evolving more rapidly than they had anticipated, with new players and complications emerging that threatened to overwhelm their ability to manage the crisis. We need to meet with Marcus, Isabella said finally. If he's being approached by people who are questioning the succession, we need to know where he stands before we make any major decisions. Alexander nodded, though the prospect of such a conversation filled him with dread. Marcus was 3 years younger and had always looked up to Alexander as both brother and future king. The idea of having to reveal the truth about their family's legitimacy and potentially ask for his support in covering it up felt like a betrayal of everything their relationship had been built on. There's something else, Alexander said, his voice heavy with a realization that had been forming throughout the meeting with Lord Blackwood. If foreign governments are already making inquiries, it means this information has spread beyond our borders. We may be dealing with international political pressure as well as domestic concerns. Isabella moved to stand beside him at the window, her presence offering the comfort and strength he had come to depend on throughout their marriage. Then we need to be smarter and move faster than our enemies. Whatever we decide to do, we need to do it decisively and completely. Alexander reached for her hand, drawing on the connection that had sustained them through 7 years of marriage and the challenges of royal life. The next few days would test everything they believed about themselves, their family, and their duty to the kingdom they were meant to serve. The crown's secret was becoming the kingdom's crisis, and they would need every ounce of wisdom, courage, and unity they possessed to navigate the treacherous path ahead. The private dining room in the east wing of Ravenshollow Palace had been chosen deliberately for its intimacy and security. Unlike the grand formal dining halls where conversations could be overheard by servants or observed by courtiers, this smaller space offered the privacy that Prince Marcus would need to process what his brother was about to reveal. Alexander stood by the fireplace, watching the flames dance, while Isabella arranged the documents they had decided to share on the mahogany table that dominated the room. Prince Marcus arrived precisely at the appointed time, his military bearing evident in his purposeful stride and erect posture. At 29, he possessed the same dark hair and strong jawline that marked him unmistakably as a member of the royal family. But where Alexander's eyes reflected the weight of future kingship, Marcus's carried the confidence of a man who had found his calling in service rather than rule. His dress uniform was immaculate, the various medals and insignia speaking to his distinguished record in Eldoria's armed forces. Alexander, Isabella, Marcus said warmly, embracing his brother and sister-in-law with the genuine affection that had always characterized their relationship. I admit I'm curious about the mysterious urgency of this meeting. Your message suggested something of considerable importance. Alexander gestured toward the chairs arranged around the table, his expression serious in a way that immediately captured Marcus's attention. Brother, what I'm about to share with you will be difficult to hear and impossible to forget. Before I begin, I need your word that this conversation will remain absolutely confidential, regardless of your reaction to what you learn. Marcus's military training had taught him to recognize when a situation required careful attention, and he nodded gravely as he took his seat. You have my word, Alexander. Whatever this is about, you can count on my discretion. Isabella moved to pour wine from a bottle they had selected from their private collection, a vintage from the vineyards of her homeland that had become their preferred choice for conversations requiring both courage and clarity. The familiar ritual of sharing wine had become a symbol of their unity through previous challenges, and she hoped it might help Marcus process what they were about to reveal. 6 months ago, Alexander began, during the renovation of the East Wing, workers discovered a hidden chamber behind what appeared to be decorative stonework. Inside that chamber, we found documents that call into question everything we believed about our family's right to rule. He paused, watching Marcus's expression shift from casual interest to focused attention. The prince's military training had taught him to gather information before forming conclusions, and Alexander could see his brother's analytical mind beginning to process the implications of what had just been said. What sort of documents? Marcus asked, his voice carrying the steady tone he used when receiving intelligence briefings. Isabella placed the photographs of the most significant documents on the table where Marcus could see them clearly. Letters, signed confessions, and official records that suggest the first king Alexander did not inherit the throne legitimately. According to these documents, he appears to have murdered the true heir and fabricated evidence to support his claim to the crown. Marcus leaned forward to examine the documents, his expression growing more grave as he recognized the official seals and formal language that marked them as genuine historical records. Alexander watched his brother's face carefully, seeing the moment when the full magnitude of the revelation became clear. These appear to be authentic, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the implications of what he was viewing. The paper, the ink, the writing style, they're consistent with documents from that period that I've seen in military archives. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and sorrow at his brother's immediate acceptance of the document's authenticity. Marcus had always been intellectually honest, sometimes to a fault, and his willingness to confront uncomfortable truths was both a strength and a potential source of conflict in the current situation. If these documents are genuine, Marcus continued, then our entire family's claim to the throne is based on murder and deception. The question is what we do with this information. Isabella appreciated Marcus's directness, though she could see the struggle in his eyes as he processed the moral and political implications of their discovery. That's exactly the question we've been wrestling with for months, Marcus, and now the situation has become more complicated because others have become aware of the document's existence. Alexander explained Lord Blackwood's visit and the growing concern that foreign governments might be taking interest in Eldoria's succession questions. Marcus listened intently, his military experience evident in his ability to quickly grasp the strategic implications of each new piece of information. Lord Blackwood is playing a careful game, Marcus observed when Alexander finished his account. He's positioning himself to be valuable regardless of how this situation develops. If you manage to contain the information, he's demonstrated loyalty and discretion. If the truth becomes public, he can claim he tried to help you manage the crisis appropriately. It was a characteristically astute analysis that confirmed Alexander's own assessment of the Chancellor's motivations. Marcus had always possessed keen insight into political maneuvering, though he typically preferred the more straightforward world of military command to the complexities of court intrigue. There's something else, Isabella said, her voice careful in a way that immediately put both brothers on alert. We've received information suggesting that some people close to you have been asking questions about the succession and whether recent developments might require changes to the established order. Marcus's expression darkened as he understood the implication. You're asking whether I'm plotting against Alexander's succession. We're asking where you stand, Alexander said gently, because we need to know whether we can count on your support as we navigate this crisis, or whether you believe these revelations require a different approach to the kingdom's leadership. Marcus was silent for several long minutes, his gaze moving between the documents on the table and the faces of his brother and sister-in-law. Alexander could see the internal struggle playing out in his brother's expression, the conflict between loyalty to family and duty to kingdom, between preserving stability and confronting truth. "Alexander," Marcus said finally, "you're my brother, and I love you. But more than that, you're a good man and a capable leader who has prepared his entire life to serve this kingdom effectively. The actions of an ancestor 2 centuries ago don't change who you are or what you're capable of achieving as king." Alexander felt a wave of relief and gratitude at his brother's words, though he sensed there was more coming. "However," Marcus continued, "I also believe that truth and integrity are essential foundations for any legitimate government. We can't build a stable future for Eldoria on a foundation of lies and deception, no matter how well-intentioned our motivations might be." Isabella leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Marcus?" "I'm suggesting that we need to find a way to address this revelation honestly while minimizing the damage to the kingdom's stability. That might mean accepting some personal consequences for our family, but it could also create an opportunity to establish a new foundation for the monarchy, based on transparency and earned legitimacy, rather than inherited deception." It was a perspective that Alexander had considered but found difficult to accept, primarily because it seemed to require sacrificing everything their family had built for the sake of correcting historical injustices. Yet he could see the moral logic in Marcus's position, and he respected his brother's willingness to prioritize principle over personal advantage. "The practical question," Alexander said, "is whether we can reveal this information in a way that strengthens rather than destroys the monarchy's position. If we simply announce that our family's claim to the throne was established through murder and deception, the result might be chaos rather than the principled reform you're envisioning." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Which means we need a strategy that allows us to control both the narrative and the timing of any revelations. We need to demonstrate that the current royal family represents a break from past corruption, rather than a continuation of it." Isabella's diplomatic experience made her particularly sensitive to the complexities of public perception and political messaging. That would require us to position Alexander not as the heir to a fraudulent dynasty, but as the leader who chose to reveal the truth and reform the monarchy when he could have remained silent. "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "But it would also require us to have a concrete plan for addressing the constitutional and political questions that would inevitably arise from such revelations. We'd need to demonstrate that transparency leads to strength rather than weakness." Alexander found himself both intrigued and terrified by the direction their conversation was taking. The idea of voluntarily revealing damaging information about his family's legitimacy went against every instinct for self-preservation, yet he could see the potential for turning a crisis into an opportunity for positive change. "What would such a strategy look like in practical terms?" he asked. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where soldiers went through their daily training exercises. "First, we'd need to complete our own investigation of the documents to ensure we understand the full scope of what happened and can present a complete and accurate account. Second, we'd need to develop a constitutional framework for addressing questions about succession and legitimacy that protects the kingdom's stability while acknowledging past wrongs. Third, we'd need to build support among key stakeholders, the military, the nobility, the church, and foreign allies, before making any public announcements." Isabella was taking notes as Marcus outlined his approach, her diplomatic training evident in her focus on the procedural and political steps that would be necessary for such a strategy to succeed. "And fourth," Marcus continued, turning back to face his brother and sister-in-law, "we'd need Alexander to demonstrate leadership that proves his worthiness to rule regardless of questions about inherited legitimacy. The monarchy's future would need to be based on earned trust and demonstrated competence rather than traditional claims to divine right or hereditary authority." Alexander appreciated the comprehensive nature of Marcus's analysis, though he remained concerned about the risks involved in such an approach. "The danger is that once we open this conversation publicly, we lose control over how it develops. Even if we present the information in the most favorable possible light, our enemies could use it to challenge not just my legitimacy, but the entire institution of monarchy." "That's true," Marcus acknowledged. "But the alternative, attempting to suppress information that's already spreading, carries even greater risks. If we're seen as trying to cover up the truth, it reinforces every negative assumption people might have about royal secrecy and corruption. Isabella set down her pen and looked up at both brothers. There's another consideration we haven't discussed. If we choose transparency, we need to be prepared for the possibility that the investigation might reveal additional uncomfortable truths about our family's history. We might be opening a door that leads to discoveries we can't anticipate. It was a sobering reminder that their current crisis might be only the beginning of a larger reckoning with their family's past. Alexander realized that choosing truth over concealment might require them to confront not just the founding deception of their dynasty, but potentially centuries of accumulated secrets and compromises. I think, Alexander said slowly, we need to make a fundamental decision about what kind of rulers we want to be and what kind of monarchy we want to leave for future generations. Are we going to be guardians of inherited privilege based on historical deception, or are we going to be leaders who earn their authority through service and transparency? Marcus smiled for the first time since the conversation began. That sounds like the Alexander I've always respected, someone who's willing to do what's right even when it's difficult. Isabella reached across the table to take Alexander's hand. Whatever we decide, we need to decide together and commit to supporting each other through whatever consequences emerge from our choice. Alexander looked at the documents spread across the table, then at his brother and wife, the two people whose judgment and loyalty he trusted above all others. The weight of the decision before them was enormous, but for the first time since discovering the hidden chamber, he felt as though they might have a path forward that honored both their principles and their responsibilities. Then let's begin developing a strategy, he said. If we're going to change the course of history, we'd better make sure we do it right. The three of them spent the next several hours outlining the steps that would be necessary to transform their family's greatest secret into their kingdom's newest beginning. It would require courage, wisdom, and more than a little luck, but for the first time in months, Alexander felt hopeful about their ability to navigate the crisis while preserving both their integrity and their service to the people of Eldoria. 3 weeks had passed since the pivotal meeting with Prince Marcus, and the great throne room of Ravenshollow Palace had never witnessed an assembly quite like the one gathering on this crisp autumn morning. Representatives from across the kingdom and beyond had been summoned for what had been described only as a matter of profound importance to the realm's future. The golden rays of sunlight streaming through the magnificent stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the assembled crowd, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the historic moment about to unfold. Crown Prince Alexander stood before the ornate throne that would one day be his, though recent weeks had forced him to question what that inheritance truly meant. Princess Isabella sat to his right, her presence a source of strength and wisdom that had become even more essential as they prepared to reshape their kingdom's understanding of truth, power, and legitimacy. Prince Marcus stood in dress uniform to Alexander's left, his military bearing a symbol of the honor and integrity that had guided their family's recent decisions. In the front rows sat the kingdom's most influential nobles, their expressions reflecting a mixture of curiosity, concern, and careful political calculation. Lord Blackwood occupied his customary position as Chancellor, his face revealing nothing of the complex negotiations and strategic planning that had brought them to this moment. Elizabeth Crawford sat nearby, her scholarly dignity unmarred by the momentous role she had played in uncovering the truth that would soon reshape their understanding of history. Behind the nobles, representatives of the church, the military, and various professional guilds filled the remaining seats, while foreign ambassadors observed from a specially designated section that afforded them both honor and discreet separation from domestic political considerations. The ambassadors from Astoria and Valeria were present, their governments having received advance briefings that ensured their support for the unprecedented announcement about to be made. Alexander stepped forward, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation pressing down upon him like a physical force. The prepared speech in his hands represented months of careful drafting, revision, and consultation with advisors, who had helped him find words adequate to the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "My fellow citizens of Eldoria," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "I stand before you today to share information that will fundamentally change our understanding of our kingdom's history and our monarchy's foundation. What I am about to tell you has been discovered through careful investigation and verified by our most respected scholars and archivists." The room fell completely silent, the gravity of Alexander's tone making clear that this was no ceremonial address or routine political announcement. Isabella could feel the tension building, as the assembled crowd recognized that they were about to witness something unprecedented. 6 months ago, during renovation work in the palace's East Wing, we discovered a hidden chamber containing documents that had been concealed for over 2 centuries. These documents reveal that the establishment of our royal dynasty was accomplished through deception, violence, and the elimination of the rightful heir to the throne. A collective gasp arose from the assembled crowd, followed by an undercurrent of murmured conversations as people began to process the implications of what they had just heard. Alexander paused, allowing the initial shock to settle before continuing with the detailed explanation that would provide context for this stunning revelation. "The first King Alexander, for whom I was named, was not the legitimate heir as recorded in our official histories. According to the documents we have discovered and authenticated, he murdered Prince Edmund, the true heir, and fabricated evidence to support his claim to the crown. The dynasty that has ruled Eldoria for over 200 years was founded on a crime that has remained hidden until now." Lord Blackwood rose from his seat, his movement drawing attention as he prepared to play his assigned role in the carefully choreographed revelation. "Your Highness, these are extraordinary claims. What evidence supports these allegations about events that occurred centuries ago?" Alexander nodded appreciatively at the Chancellor's question, which provided the perfect opening for the presentation they had prepared. "Dr. Crawford, our chief archivist, will present the evidence that led to these conclusions." Crawford approached the podium with the dignity and authority that her scholarly reputation commanded. In her hands, she carried copies of the documents that had started this entire crisis, along with supporting materials that established their authenticity and significance. The documents discovered in the hidden chamber include signed confessions from individuals involved in Prince Edmund's murder, correspondence that details the plot to eliminate the legitimate heir, and official records that were altered to support the false narrative of King Alexander's succession, Dr. Crawford explained, her voice carrying the measured authority of academic expertise. She proceeded to provide a detailed analysis of the evidence, explaining how forensic examination had confirmed the age and authenticity of the documents, how the information they contained corresponded with other historical records, and how gaps in the official record now made sense in light of these revelations. As Dr. Crawford spoke, Alexander observed the faces in the crowd, seeing a range of emotions from shock and disbelief to calculation and concern. Some of the nobles appeared to be considering the political implications for their own positions, while foreign ambassadors were undoubtedly analyzing how this revelation might affect international relationships and treaty obligations. When Dr. Crawford concluded her presentation, Alexander stepped forward again to address the questions and concerns that were undoubtedly forming in the minds of everyone present. "I know that many of you are wondering what these revelations mean for our kingdom's stability and for the legitimacy of our current government," Alexander said. "Princess Isabella, Prince Marcus, and I have spent considerable time consulting with constitutional experts, religious leaders, and international legal authorities to understand the implications of these discoveries." Isabella rose to join her husband, her diplomatic expertise essential for explaining the complex legal and political framework they had developed to address the constitutional crisis created by the historical revelations. "We have concluded," Isabella said, "that the crimes committed over 2 centuries ago, while morally reprehensible, do not automatically invalidate the governmental institutions that have developed over the intervening years. However, we believe that these revelations require us to establish new foundations for royal authority based on consent and service rather than inherited privilege." Prince Marcus stepped forward to explain the practical measures that would implement this new approach to monarchical legitimacy. "Effective immediately, we are implementing a series of reforms that will transform our monarchy from an institution based on hereditary right to one based on demonstrated service and public consent." The reforms Marcus outlined were comprehensive and unprecedented. The royal family would voluntarily limit its political powers, transferring significant authority to elected representatives and constitutional bodies. Regular referendums would allow the citizenry to confirm or reject the monarchy's continuation. Financial transparency would end the traditional secrecy surrounding royal expenses and investments. Most significantly, Future monarchs would be required to earn their position through demonstrated public service rather than automatic inheritance. These reforms, Marcus explained, are designed to ensure that our monarchy serves the people of Eldoria rather than expecting the people to serve the monarchy. We believe that legitimacy must be earned through service, not inherited through bloodline. Lord Blackwood rose again, this time to address the international implications of these unprecedented changes. We have consulted with our allied nations to ensure that these reforms will strengthen rather than weaken Eldoria's position in international affairs. The governments of our neighboring kingdoms have expressed support for our commitment to transparency and democratic principles. Alexander could see that the assembled crowd was beginning to understand that they were witnessing not just the revelation of historical crimes, but the voluntary transformation of their governmental system in response to uncomfortable truths. The monarchy was essentially dissolving itself as traditionally understood and reconstituting itself as something entirely new. "I want to be clear about my personal position," Alexander said, his voice carrying the conviction that had sustained him through months of difficult decisions. "I could have chosen to suppress this information and continue ruling based on the false foundations established by my ancestor. Instead, I believe that true leadership requires the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and to build new foundations based on integrity rather than deception." Isabella added her own perspective on the moral dimensions of their choice. "We believe that the people of Eldoria deserve leaders who earn their authority through service, and who maintain that authority through demonstrated competence and ethical behavior. These reforms will ensure that future monarchs meet those standards." The foreign ambassadors were taking detailed notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a historic transformation that would likely influence political developments in their own kingdoms. The precedent being set, of a monarchy voluntarily limiting its own power and submitting to public accountability, was unprecedented in the modern world. Prince Marcus addressed the practical concerns about stability and continuity that were undoubtedly troubling some observers. These reforms will be implemented gradually over the next 2 years, with careful attention to maintaining stability and effectiveness in government operations. We are not dismantling our institutions, but rather evolving them to better serve their fundamental purposes. Crawford returned to the podium to address questions about the ongoing historical investigation. "We will continue our examination of royal archives to ensure that any additional relevant information is brought to light. Transparency requires that we confront the full truth about our history, not just the portions that are convenient or comfortable." As the formal presentations concluded, Alexander opened the floor for questions from the assembled representatives. The first to speak was Duke Harrison, one of the most senior nobles and a man whose judgment was widely respected throughout the kingdom. "Your Highness, while I admire the moral courage required to reveal this information, I am concerned about the potential for political instability during the transition period you have outlined. How can you ensure that these reforms will strengthen, rather than weaken our kingdom's ability to respond to external threats or internal challenges?" It was exactly the type of practical question that Alexander had expected and prepared to address. "Duke Harrison, our reforms are designed to increase rather than decrease governmental effectiveness by ensuring that authority is based on competence rather than accident of birth. Leaders who must earn and maintain their positions through demonstrated service are more likely to be effective than those who inherit power regardless of their capabilities." Isabella added her perspective on the international dimensions of the Duke's concern. "We believe that democracies and constitutional monarchies are ultimately stronger and more stable than autocratic systems, because they derive their authority from the consent of the governed rather than from force or tradition alone." Additional questions addressed topics ranging from the practical mechanics of implementing the reforms to the potential reactions of foreign governments to the religious and moral court, implications of the royal family's unprecedented honesty about historical crimes. Father Benedict, representing the kingdom's religious establishment, offered the Church's perspective on the moral dimensions of their decision. "The courage to confess past sins and to seek redemption through reformed behavior represents the highest spiritual values. The royal family's commitment to truth and justice honors both divine law and human dignity." As the session continued, Alexander could sense that the initial shock was giving way to a more thoughtful consideration of the reform's potential benefits. The comprehensive nature of their presentation and the careful planning that had gone into addressing practical concerns seemed to be reassuring those who had been most worried about stability and continuity. When the formal session concluded, Alexander felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with anticipation about the challenges that lay ahead. They had successfully navigated the most dangerous moment, the revelation of information that could have destroyed their family's position, and had emerged with a plan that preserved both their integrity and their service to the kingdom. In the weeks that followed, public reaction to the unprecedented announcement was overwhelmingly positive. Citizens expressed appreciation for their leader's honesty and courage, while international observers praised Eldoria as a model for political evolution and democratic reform. The monarchy that emerged from the crisis was stronger and more legitimate than the one that had entered it, precisely because it was based on chosen service rather than inherited privilege. Isabella reflected on the transformation as she and Alexander walked through the palace gardens one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to symbolize the new chapter they had opened for their kingdom. "We chose the more difficult path," she said, "but it was also the right path. Future generations will inherit a government based on truth and service rather than lies and privilege." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that would always accompany leadership, but also the satisfaction of knowing that their authority was now based on the trust and consent of the people they served rather than on the crimes of ancestors they had never known. The crown's secret had become the kingdom's foundation for a new kind of monarchy, one that proved that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the courage to admit weakness, and that the most lasting authority is earned through service rather than inherited through blood. Their choice to embrace truth over convenience had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire future of their realm, creating a legacy that would inspire leaders and citizens for generations to come.